This is Greg for Teslafaninsight. Thanks once again for joining us. Today we focus on new news from the Giga factory in Austin, as well as an update of investing trading this week in Tesla. This is Greg for Teslafaninsight. Thanks once again for joining us. We also want to thank our Patreon supporters. If you'd like some good information on better investing and trading, please join us on Patreon. We also wanted to note that this is a copyrighted broadcast. Any reproduction of the analysis provided here is prohibited without permission. So I'd have to say this has been a little bit of we kind of knew it would happen, but it's still a disappointment week when it comes to investing and trading Tesla. As you know, it's Thursday, the 19th of August 2021, and we've had kind of an up and down week. And I actually was hoping, based on the fact that the stock got into the 93 zone yesterday, or 693, we might see a similar run over that number. But the whole pin process of Friday has sort of taken over, dropped the stock to 73 or 673-ish for the close, and now we're waiting on any major developments that might come from AI Day. I would have to say that we haven't made AI that big a deal, and the main reason is that, as you may recall, after Tesla transitioned from Mobileye over to its own sort of facilities, with Elon leading that effort and sort of a rotating door of different directors of that space, that the product or the concept has been improving nicely over time. But there seems to be a problem going on where we're still having some issues, and there are still some accidents occurring, and there's still some investigations happening there. What I kept thinking about as I've heard all this is just the fact that I have a good friend who's a PhD software engineer from Silicon Valley who has a lot of relationships there, and he was pointing out that there are some firms that, you know, if the manager says it'll take a year, the senior person, in this case Elon, will say, I'll give you 6 months. And so you get into this back and forth game where people are like, yeah, so now they've learned a lesson that if it'll take a year, they ask for 2, knowing it'll be cut in half. So you go for this back and forth, and then, you know, the results are what they are. I'd also have to say that we have a show coming up regarding the transition from radar, sonar into just cameras. And this is an interesting decision, but I was actually, we sort of did some interviews on this, and we'll be presenting a show on it, but I was actually hoping that we might see costs fall enough where both sonar, radar, cameras, and the LiDAR could be used to just give multiple options for this machine to win. But that would be a very expensive route to go, and we'll see if, you know, the cost of everything is falling. So, as you know, it's been a tough week. Tesla's down. I believe that one of the other problems, obviously, we're having this week is that if you watch oil prices every day, as we've recommended you do so, it's sort of signaling oil was operating in that 67 to 69 range, at the mid-range, at the high range in the 75 to 78 range, and now it's in the 62 to 64 range, and seems to be heading south as we have the COVID variant starting to really take effect in terms of travel, etc. So it's clear that, yeah, the market's going to get hurt in the short term, because you have to see who's going to win and lose during this period. And I would say that people like Pfizer, Moderna, and J&J will probably do very well here and we'll see how everybody else does, but clearly they and their suppliers are going to do quite well. So we'll see how that all plays out. So there are a few points that I picked up about what's going on right now in the Giga factory, I think, to maybe give us a little bit of good news to head the week out that's been kind of rough. The first point is we're now starting to see test vehicles that are now sitting outside of the main production area for the Model Ys in Austin. I think this is awesome. We're getting some numbers, not huge numbers, but there's another variable here that happens in Austin that doesn't happen in Fremont, which is that there's actually internal parking for vehicles. So the actual number of cars that are finished in the test process could be higher than the drones can see, but nonetheless, it is thrilling to see vehicles now starting to show up outside. Now, what is going to happen with those vehicles, etc.? Yes, they're training vehicles, but I would say that in the next week or so, we're going to start seeing vehicles that are still test and at low volume, but now those vehicles are going to be good enough to be recategorized after quality control into vehicles that can actually be delivered and will be recategorized for sale. Now, based on where we are now, second week of August, I believe that, keep our fingers crossed, first week of September is when we're going to start seeing scale production, 1,000, 2,000 cars a week perhaps. Worst case, best case, 5,000 to 10,000 cars a week, or at least 5,000. 10,000 I think is a little bit unrealistic right now. So one of the questions we were asking from different sources was, now wait a second, it's great if we can see some production, but everybody's having shortages when it comes to chips related to the production of their automobiles, especially now that Tesla's moved into production in Austin and then potentially production starting also in Germany. And the response we got on that was there's a difference between a shortage of chips and Tesla not having enough chips to produce vehicles. And so therefore, they're actually very secretive, but I think this is a good sign. One of the other notes for the week, and there was just an article that came out today regarding the number of customers that have had their delivery dates pushed back. It's very bad news if people have been promised cars and they have not arrived. My understanding is at all of the factories, in this case, both in Germany and in Austin, they're actually running overtime and producing as fast as they possibly can, and they're behind because demand is so high. So one of the lurking questions about Tesla has been, now wait a second, it's great that you're building new factories, but Elon's not telling us what the order backlog is except for what's going on with the Cybertruck. And so therefore we're in an interesting zone right now because how do you know how to value everything if you don't know what the order book looks like? And the answer we're now getting is that there's a backup of demand orders that have not been fulfilled. And so therefore we have this situation of folks having to rent cars and it's expensive, etc. And so I just think that we're in the zone right now where there is a real need to have Austin start producing. And I think that it'll start earlier than expected. And then those numbers get added and we see a nice push in the stock price. When will this happen? I really, really think that week 1 September is highly likely, but don't be shocked if we get the end of August to start seeing scale cars coming out of that facility. Even if the battery plant isn't up fully, they're bringing in batteries from elsewhere to fill that void. So I actually learned a new term on Tesla this week, and there's something called light speed, which is pretty fast. But there's a new term that I've been introduced to called Godspeed, which is how fast Tesla tends to operate. And so I really think that Godspeed is in September for production, and then we can rack up all those numbers nicely pushing towards having a great quarter number to show. And then the subsequent quarter number would even be better because you now have those two factories actually running at a decent output flow. We also, so therefore, I really think Godspeed is available. And I really think, based on what a lot of our viewers have shared, there's another component of this, which is not only is there Godspeed available, but the relationship between sort of the Tesla engineers and the new Giga presses has actually been running quite smoothly in other locations. And so therefore, they've been sort of preparing and starting to produce over the last 6 to 8 weeks. And I think it's realistic that 2.5 months of sort of preparation to get to production on those entities is actually pretty realistic. Also, given the fact that when they set up the production lines in Germany, at those factories, they're actually being delivered with robots and everything in place, ready to produce. So if we can get a good month worth of training for employees to go with it, I'm just pleasantly hopeful that we're going to end up with a solid month of 2,000 to 5,000 vehicles a week times 4 weeks going on there to sort of help sort of push extra numbers through that set us up for a great quarter, headed into a great final quarter of the year. So one of the reasons I'm also hoping for that to be the case is that it just seems like we're stuck in this zone of, we were stuck at 650 as the average number, but we picked up some nice push from the earnings numbers of 2 weeks ago, and we're able to get over 720. But with the COVID rebirth and the market going negative, we've sort of had a downward push to go with the normal pin process that seems to be going on. So leaves us where we are now, 673. What's next? I think that the market doesn't head south further. We end up with our pop-up early part of next week, and then we start our process again, heading into the pin, with the exception being if there's something really cool that shows up in terms of us starting to see large numbers coming out of Austin initially, and potentially Germany